Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, Germany. And I work mostly on modeling the impacts of climate extremes on agriculture using the GGCMI crop model output. And I'll be presenting some sort of initial methods and results from this work over the last few months and of my PhD. So I want to begin by highlighting something that I think most of us already are aware of, but I think it's still important to emphasize, and that is that with climate change, not only the mean of yields, but also the entire distribution of yields will shift. And to highlight what I mean by this, I have this time series of wheat yields from Germany from the GGCMI crop models from 1920 to the end of the 22nd century. And it's quite evident from this figure that the mean yield in this region is expected to increase significantly by the end of that period. But and these sorts of analyses of shifts in the mean yield is typically what is done when we look at assessments of climate impacts on crops or the agricultural system in general. So for example, this paper by AgMIP10 from 2021, they use the GGCMI crop model outputs to sort of assess how mean yields will change in different regions of the world. But if we go beyond that and look instead of mean yields at sort of yield anomalies as shown in this time series at the bottom, we can also start to think about how yield variability and year-to-year variability in the yield will change in the future. So now if we look at the distributions on the right, we see that not only the means as in the top figure, but also the width of the distribution as in the variability of yields from year to year shifts in the future in this region as shown in the models. And this also has been studied to some extent in past studies. So this paper by Liu et al. From 2021 tries to sort of quantify how this variability in yields will change in the future. But I'm interested specifically in the shift in extreme yield events in the future, or more specifically, climate extreme-driven extreme yield events in the future. So essentially how this tail of the distribution of yields will shift in the future. Exactly, so that's sort of the overarching question that I want to answer using these crop model simulations. So when it comes to assessing crop yield impacts of climate change, one of the main challenges is that the models we have diverge considerably in their estimates of the future impacts of climate change on crop yields. And I don't mean divergence only in terms of the crop models behaving very differently, which a lot of you probably know better than me. But what I want to focus on is the fact that when we use different climate models or different driving data sets to drive these crop models, they can also diverge significantly from that aspect. So now, again, I show you the time series of wheat yields projected for Germany, but now disaggregated by the 5 different climate models that are used to run the crop models in the GGCMI ensemble. And from this, we can already see that in the middle of the century, projections for wheat yields in this region already differ quite a lot across these 5 different driving climate model simulations. And when we start to think about why that is, it's quite clear that the reason for that, I mean, the only difference in these simulations is the underlying climate data used. So the reason for this divergence must come somehow from the climatic drivers and conditions that go into these models. So if you look at the temperature, projected temperature changes in this period, in this region, in the 5 different models, we see that in the same period, also the mean temperature in this case, is projected to sort of diverge, or it's projected to change differently across the 5 models. And one way of sort of getting around this problem is to move from looking at fixed windows to looking at what's known as global warming levels. So instead of looking at just these 20 years, you can look at different 20 years for the different climate models to sort of ensure that they all have a similar temperature change. But what that ends up doing is shifting the uncertainty, so to say, from temperature to CO2 levels. Because if you look at different 20-year periods, the CO2 levels in those 20-year periods will be very different in the 5 climate models. And then that results in the mean yield estimates being even more different in the global warming level estimates as compared to the fixed 20-year period. And this also is quite well understood. So we know that looking at global warming levels, you sort of align the models based on temperature, but then the CO2 levels go out of sync, and then your estimates of yield impacts as a result also diverge significantly. But as I mentioned, I'm interested particularly in looking at extreme yield impacts and not only or not the mean changes in yields in the future. And as it turns out, the global warming level approach is still a significantly is still a useful approach in looking at these extreme yield impacts in the future. So now again, I show you a time series of projected yield anomalies in this case across the 5 different climate models for wheat yield in the same region. And if we first look at how these anomalies are projected to change in, again, the same period of 2050 to 2070 across the 5 models. So we see that the distributions of these anomalies when using this fixed 20-year period are relatively sort of not are quite divergent across the 5 climate models. But then when we instead use different 20-year periods based on the global warming levels, we see that they become more, the difference between them is much lower. Now, of course, this is only one region and one specific case, but there is a case to be made that this approach of using global warming levels to study extreme impacts has a solid theoretical basis. And the 2 reasons which I want to highlight which make this a useful approach, the first is that climatic impact drivers have been shown to scale with global warming levels. So if we think about the actual events or the actual climatic conditions that lead to these extreme loss events, many of them have been shown to scale with global warming levels. For example, extreme heat days or even drying days in certain regions. And the second is that yield anomalies, unlike mean yields, are driven primarily by climatic conditions and are not determined to a great degree by CO2 concentrations, which allows us to use the global warming level approach without having to worry as much about the differences in CO2 concentrations in those different periods as we did for the mean yield estimates. Now I want to also sort of mention what exactly I mean when what exactly I do when I mention this global warming level approach. So the sort of steps I follow in my methods. So the first step is obviously to define the global warming levels. Then I pool all available crop model simulations at those different global warming levels, so across climate models and scenarios, and the 20 years for each global warming level. So in theory, there could be as many as 300 years of crop model simulations available for each global warming level. Then, since want to look at extreme yield changes, I have to define some metric of what I mean by extreme yield events. So in this case, I just use the 5th percentile of these anomalies as my metric, which I sort of track to see how that changes in the future. Then I compute this metric on the pool data, and then this can be done at each grid cell and each global warming level to sort of get a picture of how this changes in the future. So the main finding from using this approach is that in most wheat growing regions of the world, the low yield events will become more intense. So the 5th percentile event will become more intense in the future. So this is for 3 degrees of global warming level, and it's the median of the GGCMI crop model simulations. And yeah, so the units are percent change with respect to the baseline yield. And then a similar approach can obviously also be done for other crops using the same simulations. Yeah, so we see that for most crops and most regions, the low extreme events are projected to become more intense. In this case, at 3 degrees of global warming level, but we can also do the same for different degrees and different scenarios. So just to quickly highlight the main take-home messages. So not only the mean yield, but also extremes and the variability of yields is changing, and that's also important to study. In traditional approaches to study yield impacts of climate change, results diverge significantly because of the temperature and CO2 dependence of yields. But global warming levels are a useful approach to study extreme yield impacts in the future. And using this approach, we find that large parts of current crop growing regions show increases in the magnitude of low yield events. Yeah, and that's all from my side. If I'm open to questions, if I have time, I think I've run out of time, but I'm also happy to chat about my work later. You can reach out to me by email. Thank you.
Thank you, Reader. So we still have time for a few quick questions if there's any.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Vitor, for the great work. A few slides back, it caught my eye that for maize, these 4 maps, yeah. For maize, which is a crop where we consistently project declines in the mean yield, you mostly see less severe extreme events. And for crops where we simulate across the board positive changes, you see a decline in extreme events. Right. I wonder if there's a decline in the yield level of extreme events, right? Like more severe things, so red versus blue. And I wonder if there is a relationship between those two features in the simulations.
Right. I mean, so when the mean yields of a crop increase, the year-to-year variability also naturally increases. So I've tried to account for that by, like, in the detrending method I use, I sort of detrend the 2 periods I use individually. So, like, I subtract the mean from the 2 periods separately. So I would think that doing that should get rid of that effect. But yeah, I'm not sure if this fully does account for that fact that increasing mean yields would also lead to increasing, like, year-to-year variability and then naturally also extremes. But yeah, so I think that should be corrected in the detrending method that I use. So maybe we can discuss more how to adequately detrend the data.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Yeonu Kim, and yeah, thank you for the nice presentations. My questions will be related to the climate data sets. So you're using the outputs of GGCMI, right? Mm. And I want to ask if there's any plan in GGCMI to use a little bit more appropriate climate data sets for assessing extreme events. I think nowadays, like SMILE or other those kind of large ensemble is becoming more standard for assessing extreme events, the impact. So do you know or have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, SMILEs are something I've also thought about using because, as you mentioned, like using just one climate model simulation per crop model doesn't really capture the full distribution of potential climates and extreme events. So yeah, I think there is some interest in also looking at how we can work with SMILEs in the GGCMI project or group. But yeah, I'm not really sure what the concrete next steps in that direction will be. But yeah, that's definitely interested and thought about that. Thanks.
Thanks also from my side for a great presentation. You concluded, or you have in one slide, that the CO2 effects are not as relevant for these extreme anomalies. But there's evidence from face experiments that the crop temperature actually increases also in crops like wheat that already have a lower temperature threshold for reproductive damage. So has that been considered when you make that statement?
So yes, I have also come across these studies that sort of like the temperature dependence of certain crops also does depend on CO2 levels. But I think the idea is more that certain sorts of extreme events like heat waves, their impacts are, I mean, not completely independent of CO2 levels, but a heat wave, even at low CO2 levels and also at high CO2 levels, probably has major crop yield impacts. I mean, the impact may not be exactly the same at low and high CO2 levels, but I think to a first generalization, a first approximation, it still is a sort of safe assumption. Yeah, but I'm happy to also discuss whether that's a fair assumption in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Vitor. And our second speaker is Christian Phobos, who has been, he's the senior researcher in the IASA as well as a participant of GGCMI for more than a decade. Yeah, he's a non-expert in process modeling, but apparently what he is sharing today is the new data-driven and hybrid modeling efforts. Yeah. So Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you. May I actually use this microphone? Much easier for me. I never managed to speak into those stationary ones. So I'll try like this, then I can also point more easily. So thanks for having me and thanks for joining the presentation. As a brief background on the topic, in the past days, we have seen many presentations on growing season adaptation or planting date adaptation. at the point scale and at the regional scale. But globally, this is often still lacking also in our ensemble exercises. And there are first few studies coming out, for example, from the PIC team on adapting growing seasons with their model. And broadly, there are two approaches to estimating optimal growing season. One is the use of climate envelopes, based, for example, on temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, to see what period of the year should be most feasible for a crop. And another approach that we have been using in the past is yield optimization. So you basically plant the crop in monthly or in weekly time steps throughout the year. You run your simulation and then you select your optimal planting date, and then you can average this over time, for example, or look at specific time windows. And that's something I did 15 years ago when I first started in this field, when we didn't have global crop calendars. I ran my model 50 times per year to estimate the optimal planting date, average for 30 years. And then I assumed this is what farmers would be doing. But then if you look at climate change, this becomes like a huge effort to do for many climate scenarios, for emission pathways. And that's where we think emulators can be quite handy. And that is what I'm going to speak about today. So let me try. Maybe I have to point in this direction. Oh, no, that was too fast now. Yeah, so sorry. This shows basically, okay, sorry. Yeah, someone is restarting it for me, so I'm trying to take it a bit more slowly. Yeah. Right, thanks. Okay, so this is, no, it was again, but I pointed only once. And yeah, thanks. Okay, all right. So this is basically our emulator. The crop model emulator suite, as we call it, CHROMES, that is under a discussion as a preprint in geoscientific model development. And what we are doing here is we run our global crop model simulations basically with the AgMIP10 GGCMI aligned protocol for a range of GCMs, SSPs, globally at the 5 arc-minute resolution, or our model actually runs at the, gets 5 arc-minute, or the climate data at the half-degree resolution. Then we get our crop yield outputs for the different SSPs idealized here. And then we feed both into machine learning algorithms. So we take our daily weather data, we aggregate this for the growing season for specific substages. We feed both the result and these inputs into machine learning algorithms, train emulators for our model. And then we can apply this for a wider range of scenarios. So one application would be that we can cover a wider range of CMIP6 projections, that we can run our model for SSPs that we are presently not covering. For example, AgMIP tries to bracket the low and high emission pathways, but EU stakeholders are more interested in SSP 245, so we can then fill in those scenarios. And this is shown at the bottom of various use cases. And here we see on the left our feature engineering. Basically, we have our pre-growing season of 30 days. Here we aggregate a couple of climate variables. Then we have the planting of the crop. We have a GDD accumulation. We have a harvest date. And this basically provides us with a dynamic growing season. And for these, we are estimating those climate features, which are temperature sums, radiation sums, precipitation, etc. And we are also subdividing the whole growing season. So at the bottom, we have AGS, what we call the actual growing season. That's going from planting here all the way to harvest, which is what we consider a biomass indicator. Then we have AGSR, which is the reproductive phase, shown here in red, which is only the second half of the growing season, where our model has its yield formation, harvest index, estimation, etc. So we have different stages here represented. And here we see the major advantage of this method. This is the time requirement for an epic run. The lower parts here are data pre-processing. Once this is done, you only have to run the model, which takes still 12 hours for one crop and water management scenarios. And on the right-hand side, we see the emulator, where also only the 2 upper boxes after data pre-processing is the time requirement, which is about 15 minutes. So we can very fast get to these yield predictions. And for the performance of this emulator, naturally, that's the key question. I guess our present standard test is that we have these 5 GCMs, IPSL, GFDL, basically what Vidur showed in the prior presentation. And we train this emulator for 1 GCM, IPSL, and then we apply it to an emulator, to a GCM that hasn't been seen in the training, GFDL, for example. And we hypothesize if we can train it on one of those and apply it to the others, then we can basically, within this domain of those SSPs, apply it to unseen climate data. And here we see the evaluation across space and time points, basically all the data points we got, the yields from the emulator and from EPIC with a very high R-square and then near perfect fit. So the emulator is working very well here. On the right-hand side, we see the performance for different SSPs as a global area weighted mean. Blue is EPIC again, red are different emulators. Here we are basically training on all the different GCMs and then applying to all the different unseen GCMs. And again, we have a near perfect fit where we see an offset is for UK ESM towards the end of the century. This is basically due to the training domain. All the other GCMs have a lower warming level, and to replicate UK ESM, we would need to include these very high temperatures. And on the bottom left here, finally, we see the R-square per pixel, basically for the 80-85 year time series that we're looking at. Bluish is a high R-square above 0.6, 0.7, and that's something we find in most of those pixels, so we can really also get this interannual yield variability. Probably not easy to see as we also have a few red spots, don't want to hide them. So there are also places where we have a rather flat signal, but we also need to recognize that there are places where we have a rather flat yield signal. And there it's naturally quite difficult to get an R-square. So there you also want to look into RMSE and other statistical performance indicators. So that was a long introduction to get finally to the actual topic. What we're now applying in the emulator here is the growing season adaptation. And here we only see this in the bottom left. The rest of the schematic is the same. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, here we see a variety of planting dates on the x-axis. Those are basically the days of the year on which we can plant the crop. This is the crop yield, and the lines here show the mean yield for a decade. And we are using here 52 time steps shown over there. So it's basically a weekly approach. We plant each week, get the highest yield, and then see what's the optimal planting date. And here blue is the baseline period 2020. And then we go down over time and we see the mean yields decrease with time, but also this peak is shifting from here to over there. So if we would use just this baseline planting date, we would get this yield. And if we move a bit up here, this is basically the compensation of yield loss that we can get from such a growing season optimization. But another advantage of this method is that we can get annual yields, and we can not only look at this shift in a growing season, we can also look at standard deviation in optimal growing season dates. So basically, is the optimal growing season fluctuating more strongly in the future? And we can also look at the breadth of this peak. Basically, how wide is your planting window? Do farmers have to plant more accurately in the future if it gets more steep, or do they get a wider window? Yeah, and so based on this, we decided not to focus on the adaptation potential per se, but we are trying to define what we call challenges imposed by climate change. So it's basically a challenge is that we have the shift in planting dates out of the present range of growing season dates. This is what we call a challenge. So then you really need to adapt and you get to a new normal. Then as I mentioned, we may have a narrowing planting window that poses new challenges to farmers. We may have unstable growing seasons. We may have periods of rapid planting date change, like they may change for a time steadily, but then you have a jump if you, for example, run into the new precipitation regime in a place. And we may have non-monotonic planting date shifts, basically that your planting date advances when it gets warmer, but then again, if you have a change in precipitation regimes, your planting date may become later again. So farmers first have to adapt to this earlier planting and then later again to a later planting. And eventually as a sixth challenge, we consider fuzzy foresight. That's our common scenario that we run many different climate scenarios and see do they agree on the same direction. That's actually something I would be happy to discuss. That's then on the last slide. That's something we kind of have to make up on based on expert knowledge. I'm working here a lot with mathematicians, and they always ask me, well, what are the papers saying this? Oh, sorry, I see I'm running out of time. So I will skip this slide here. Basically, our key metric is the time of emergence, adapted from Jonas' paper, who adopted it from the climate community. It basically means you have a signal, which can be planting dates or crop yields. You have your variability, and once you move out of this, it means you're in a new normal and you're really leaving this baseline variability. So it's a quite agnostic metric that you can apply to all those challenges. And to just go into a few exemplary results, this is still all work in progress. We see here for GFDL, SSP126, the shift in planting dates, blue is later, red is earlier, and we see blue is here dominating the harvested area, that's the cumulative harvest area. where we have such an emergence over the next century, and red is then coming a bit later. And in SSP 585, it's basically the same pattern, but at the end of the century, we have around 60 to 70% of cropland with such a significant shift or an emergence in new planting dates. And to look only at SSP 585, blue shows here an earlier planting and gold a later planting, and we basically see, as assumed, that we will be planting earlier in the northern latitudes, in the tropics, maybe due to precipitation changes, we will have a later planting. So I think I'll just skip the other exemplary results. It's still really ongoing. We will quantify all of these challenges. We don't only want to look at them separately, but then also see, that's shown in this slide, in which pixel do we have how many of these adaptation challenges. So do farmers only face a shift in the planting date or an increase in the variability, or do they face several of them and have to cope with a complex new compound challenge in growing seasons? Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're very happy to discuss these challenges. If anybody has experience also from other spatial scales, what challenges are farmers really facing with respect to growing seasons and the changes? Are there any other challenges? And how can this be best quantified? What we need to factor in is cultivar adaptation, still missing here, climate projection uncertainty, and then connect this. That's one of the advantages of the emulator, directly to this connection between crop yields and growing seasons. Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. Now we take one quick question. Yes, Jonas.
Wonderful, excellent. I'm very inspired. Awesome work. I have to digest the methods a little bit more. Quick question about the fitting and feature selection. So if you're training on current or currently simulated growing seasons, you may miss on factors that are important outside those. So think of late frost, soil moisture issues, field workability. How could an emulator get to that? How can you say, if I plant 2 weeks earlier, see those factors? And then would it make sense? I guess it would, but do you have the capacity to run EPIC to validate or confirm or corroborate those findings and, say it actually makes sense in the model too?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Really very important. Yeah, the last point is something we have on the agenda, like we will subsample then these different dates also where it's not really doing so well, and then see how this plays out in EPIC. We are also, and then if it doesn't, we will increase the training space simply by running EPIC for a stratified subsample of unsuitable dates. So far, our assumption is that at least where we have this peak, we should be doing good enough because farmers aren't stupid and they at least presently plant somehow optimally. So we think we can represent this peak quite well. But when we run into these uncomfortable conditions, we may be running out of the bounds. When it comes to other limitations, like field workability, that's something that we presently don't have in the models, but that's something we think we can also factor in ex post, for example, that you basically use such indicators as an additional model and then limit those dates you can select from. We have also one student looking into multiple cropping systems or double cropping, and she is, for example, looking into soybean and then limiting the maize dates by those seasons that are required by the soybean. So there are different approaches how you can play around with these evaluations. Thanks.
So thank you, Christian.
Thanks again. Sorry for going over time.
So we are welcoming next speaker, AgMIP.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I'm not sure how we're gonna work out the presentation. Yeah.
So you can start.
Yeah, I just have a question on how I can move on the slides. Okay, then. Okay. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm AgMIP10. I am affiliated with Julius-Kühn Institute in Kleinmachnow, and today I'm going to be showing some results and methods from our exercise where we calibrated the Ceres-Barley model to use for idiotyping drought tolerance in spring barley and their German growth conditions. So yeah, it is known among scientists, climatologists, that climate change is causing an increase of mean temperatures, and with that, we are also predicting a high variability in precipitations. And when it comes to Central Europe and in Germany as well, there is a high variability, specifically during spring months, which makes spring crops the production of spring crops more critical because of unpredictability of abiotic stresses, and this is why we are in need of climate resilience strategies that takes in account timing of abiotic stress. So in this study, we are using crop modeling as a tool to investigate genotype environment interactions by simulating the plant soil atmosphere system. We first start by parameterizing the Ceres-Barley model to German environmental conditions, and then we move on into investigating drought stress tolerant idiotypes with a focus on timing of droughts during the growing season. So for the parameterization of the DSS Ceres-Barley, we are using a comprehensive experimental database, which includes 2 years of phenotyping field experiments, as well as a multi-environmental trial data sets, which covers 35 site years of pre-registration trials from 2014 until 2019. And for the calibration, we used the time series estimator, starting with phenology-related parameters, then moving on to growth-related parameters, and finishing the parameterization with a calibration of grain yield and grain yield related parameters. So for the phenology, the calibration phenology, we use 2/3 of the data set for the calibration data set, and 1/3 for the validation data set. We obtain an RMSE of around 6 days. And when it comes to growth parameters such as LAI and biomass, we use the field experiments, and we end up with an RMSE of 0.2. And finally, we obtained a yield calibration with an RMSE of around 800 kilograms per hectare, which we deemed as satisfactory. So now that we have our model parameters calibrated, we move on to the workflow for the idiotyping. We are using soil from 2 locations that are characterized with low precipitations, and 1 location with a poor soil quality, and Olvenstadt, Berlin with poor soil quality, and Olvenstadt, second location with a good soil quality. So for these 2 locations, we are using weather data, simulated weather data from 5 GCMs and 2 RCPs from 2021 until 2061. And we are using this weather data to simulate the in silico experiment, where we use the calibrated model. We then extract from the output of the model, the water stress index during vegetative stages as well as reproductive stages. And after that, we cluster years and scenarios based on drought timing and intensity. So for the no drought cluster, it's where water stress index is with low intensity during both reproductive and vegetative stages. And yeah, each cluster would be used to optimize 1 idiotype. We also define the set of year scenarios with random drought conditions as well to optimize for comparison. So we use the calibrated model parameters as a starting point for our optimization, and we will be optimizing phenology related parameters only. And for the range of variation of each parameter, we are using a range based on literature. So using the clustered year scenarios, we will be running our optimization using a derivative research algorithm that will be providing the DSH-Seres-Parley model, the set of phenology related parameters, with which it will simulate yield, and this loop will go on and on until we have our optimized set of parameters. So when we simulate the yields of the different idiotypes, we obtain the higher yields compared to the elite genotype, which was what we calibrated the model with and then when we look at phenology, the first observation is that for all the idiotypes, we have a later maturity for the optimized idiotypes compared to the elite genotype, except for the late drought, the idiotype that was optimized for late drought, where we have an early maturity, which was coupled with a longer grain filling phase compared to the elite genotype. And when we plot the yields overall, the period from the 2021 until 2061, we can see that the best performing idiotype would differ from a year to another within the same location. And this depending on the occurrence and the timing of droughts. We can see in Berlin, for example, most of the years, the idiotype that was optimized for early and late drought, for the combination of early and late drought is the best performing. This would make sense since for Berlin, it's a poor soil location with a high occurrence of the combination of early and late drought. And this, as I said, the point that from a year to another, different idiotypes would be best performing, would suggest that diversifying cultivars across different environments would lead to more stable and higher yields. So this would be our next step, is to create a portfolio of idiotypes for each year for the same location, so we can achieve optimized and stable yields. So as a summary, we developed a workflow to design idiotypes under different drought conditions. And we observed that the idiotypes were characterized by a later maturity phase, except for the idiotype that was optimized for late drought, which we observed in a short maturity with longer grain filling phase. And also, as I mentioned, the best performing idiotypes can vary in between years in the same location, which is why one of our next steps is to investigate potential cultivar diversification in different regions across Germany. And also, we are thinking to couple LCA with crop modeling so we can have an additional optimization target, which is minimizing the environmental impact and carbon footprint. Yeah. And yeah, thank you for listening. And this research was funded by the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture and I'm happy to listen to your feedback and questions.
Thank you, Asmi. We have several time. Maybe we can have 2 quick questions. Any questions? So I have a question. I want to know which type of treat the parameter correspond to. Can you introduce more about that part? The treat of the biology, and they are corresponding to the parameters.
Which type of trait?
Treat, yeah. Treat to parameters.
So we, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but yeah, we optimize mainly phenology-related parameters. Yeah, related to the duration of vegetative stages, duration of grain filling stage. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Riona. No. No, sorry, maybe my pronunciation is a little bit problem. Riona, sorry, it's yeah. It's you. Sorry. Sorry, I'm a little bit.
No, don't worry. Yeah, okay, that's me. So my name is Raniero della Peruta. I work at the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change. And we have been looking at yeah. Okay, let's try again. Coffee agrosystems and climate change. Coffee agrosystems are among the most important agri-food systems globally. They represent a main source of income for many millions of farmers, most of them with a low income status. Climate change has been shown to may have negative impacts, including lower yields, affecting the sustainability of production in future. Some adaptation measures have been proposed, but their effectiveness is still quite uncertain. So our objectives were to set up a regional scale modeling tool built around a process-based model called DynaCoff, especially designed for coffee agrosystems, and assess the response of Arabica coffee yield to climate projections in Latin America and Africa. We are aware this is a quite ambitious goal. This is a first attempt to it. And then evaluate increased shedding as an adaptation option. Increased shedding has been shown to create a microclimate within the canopy in agroforestry settings that may have a positive effect in mitigating the negative effect of climate change. So that's why we were testing this option. DynaCoff is a mechanistic plot scale daily step model developed by Rémi Vézy and colleagues at CIRAD Montpellier, France. It has 2 vegetation layers and 3 soil layers, actually. This model allows for the simulation of competition for water and light between the vegetation layers. The variables that have high variability inside the plot are simulated using meta models that were derived from 3-dimensional models of the canopy. So it should be able to simulate correctly these processes and allow for the evaluation of management options. So, so we built this regional scale modeling framework, basically with DynaCoff at the core and handling inputs data, in this case, daily climate time series derived from multimodal ensembles of past reanalysis and future projections, digital terrain model, and soil properties, gridded layers. and coming out with some outputs to interpret the results. So first of all, we tested the sensitivity of the model to some of the input variables, and we found a very strong negative correlation with mean annual temperature and positive correlation with mean annual rain and soil water at field capacity, which makes sense, and it is consistent with the literature regarding the effect of climate variables on coffee yields. Regarding the accuracy, I was modifying that. But anyways, the performance of the model in terms of at some plot scales for which we had access to data, which was one of the most difficult things to do, get access to data to test the model. And at regional scale, in some southern Brazilian states where we had data, public data aggregated at so-called mesoregion level. So at these few sites, the model seems to behave correctly. At regional sites, the error is larger, probably due to the fact that at regional level it's very difficult to articulate, or even impossible to articulate the management, the information about the management at this level. So I have to say, in this exercise that we did not change the management across the regions that we are investigating. So this is a limitation of this study. So the variation here represented as average % variation of potential yield compared to historical climate. So climate projections centered on the year 2050, with 3 different climate models and 2 different shared socio-economic pathways, one optimistic and the other one pessimistic about greenhouse gas emissions. For all 3 models and both pathways, there is clear decline in yields, both in Latin America and Africa. In Latin America is more prominent, possibly because climate models predict higher temperature increases in Latin America compared to Africa. Annual potential yield is very variable. In space, the heterogeneity is large, especially. There are some areas with increase where yield is expected to increase, and these areas seems to be located at lower latitudes, in this case for Latin America. Also, high variable, special heterogeneity for Africa, and we were asking ourselves if these green areas where yield is expected to increase according to these projections are areas at possibly higher altitudes because of the lower mean temperatures. So we tested this hypothesis, and we found that in fact environmental conditions could affect this in terms of minimum air temperature, maximum air temperature, and elevation. So it seems that yield is projected to increase in areas with lower temperatures at higher altitudes. And this also is consistent with other studies using other kinds of approach to evaluate the future suitability of areas for coffee production. So this points to a possible shift of production areas towards higher altitudes with associated suitability issues in terms of loss. So loss of biodiversity, for example, if production areas are shifted at higher elevations, but also feasibility issues in terms of is it really possible for farmers to shift these production areas in future. And then about increased shading, we compared a baseline scenario with no management change and a scenario with an increase of shading tree density by 50%. This is just one of the scenarios that we tested just for exemplification. So, for example, under this scenario with increased shading, potential yield loss is reduced in some areas, 20% of the region, but only by 2 percentage points, and this result is not statistically significant. However, it's interesting to see that in those areas where the yield loss is expected to be reduced, this is obtained even if coffee plant density is reduced, and even if the competition for water and light is increased. So it might be interesting to see which are the areas where this adaptation option could be adopted effectively. Also, it's interesting from another point of view, since it seems that the impact on yield is not so strong, one could advocate anyways to adopt these enhanced agroforestry, let's say, increasing a moderate increase of shade trees because of the other benefits that this may bring, like increased biodiversity, provisions of other goods, because yields seems to not be affected and within certain ranges so much. So I'm already at the conclusions. In spite of high uncertainties, simulations point to a clear negative trend. There is a possible shift of production areas with associated implications for land use change, ecosystem functions, and biodiversity conservation. The increased shading as an adaptation option requires further investigation, but it's rather interesting. And that's why we want to look more in detail about that in future. And also we want to implement Robusta within the Dynacoff model, because it is expected for the Robusta coffee to be more relevant in future because of its it's apparently more resilient to climate variability. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting presentation. Short question or comment. We also have a colleague working with a coffee model, and he also initially found little difference with and without shading, and then figured out that the soil data mattered a lot, whether you had actually some water limitation in the non-shaded simulation. So are you looking into those diagnostics as well?
So you mean comparing shaded with versus non-shaded in terms of water availability? Actually, we are aware that this is quite important, and but we didn't do it yet. So this is a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Hey,
yes.
Quick question. I'm fascinated. I don't know much about coffee simulations, so this is very cool. And also, I know that Florian Zabel is really interested in the work, so I would love to see, more momentum in AgMIP on those kind of specialty crops, including cocoa. My question is, yield is one thing, but I wonder if quality is maybe equally important, because I'm looking to wine in say France, where warming leads to additional sweetness and they lose the balanced acidity, and that's creating more pressure than the actual yield. So is that important in coffee too, and how would you try to model that?
For sure, this is quite important. For example, just very simple issue. Some producers are thinking of switching more to Robusta because it's more resilient, but it has a completely different qualities in terms of all the things that coffee lovers want from a coffee cup. So this is very important. Unfortunately, so far we didn't look into it, and I think it's very. This was already quite a long shot, let's say, to try to do this, and looking into the quality of coffee beans, let's say, it's going to be quite challenging. So I don't know. I cannot answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We welcome next speaker, Babaka. His research is focused on the sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Zenzi. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to share my work on evaluating crop yield variability in Senegal. And we use machine learning approaches. So this study, the motivation of our study was that we realized that from year to year, yield is varying. You have a high variability on yield in Senegal. And here we study the main crops, like 4 cereals, millet, maize, sorghum, and rice, and 1 legumes is peanut. So we realized also that even though we are increasing the techniques of cultivation areas, but we realize that we importing a lot of cereals. For instance, in 2 years ago, we export more than 800,000 of only rice. We are 8,000, so it's too much. So we're making a lot of effort, but we realize that we are not meeting, and in any case, we are not filling the gaps between import and export. And if you see here that I just saw here 2 crops, rice and peanut, for the special variability. And the yield of rice is higher because of what? In the northern part, rice is mainly irrigated. That is why in our study, we are thinking that because the yield we are getting from the for the Directory of Agriculture, they did not differentiate between irrigation and rain-fed yield. Therefore, when we are looking now, the main climatic drivers that drive yield variability, we are always just thinking why we are using yield with irrigated areas. So this is one of my questions. Maybe you have some ideas if someone have in the panel. So this motivation is that yield, we have high yield variability, and we have also higher variability of rainfall in the country from year to year, even though for the next 5 years, we realize that we are getting more rain in these areas. But temperature is increasing, and fertilizer also, we try also to increase fertilizer, and the increase of fertilizer did not increase much of yield. And so our objective is just to identify the key agrometeorological hazard driving yield variability. To do so, we have to identify the most critical agrometeorological factors contributing to yield variability, and then evaluate their impact to develop a strategy for adaptation so that we can mitigate risk and improve crop resilience. So our method is to use climate data from the National Agrometeorological Services, and we use yield data from the Directory of Forecasting and Agriculture of Agriculture. So they are mainly working on compiling yield data and all information about crops. And we combine all these things with using our XGBoost machine learning approaches. And now to look at what are the most important variables, we use what we call sub-analysis. And the variable we use to calculate our indices are rainfall, maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and relative humidity. For crops, we use rice, millet, maize, sorghum, and peanut. And then we calculate 14 agrometeorological indices classified into 3 different categories, which are drought, heat, and moisture. So we have 2 indices for drought, which is VPD and cumulative dry days. And we have 6 for heat and 6 for hazard. And then the climate data we use is what we call Hunting National Climate Services. There are data with very high resolution, spatial resolution of 4-kilometer resolution. So we use the period of 1991 to 2020, but we have the data from 1980 to 2024. But as the crop yield, we're having some missing data on the crops, so that we try to use a period where all the data are available. That is why we use like 32 climate data. So, and we use now our machine learning to ranking of the best indexes that explain yield variability. And also we use this to do so, we use the sub-analysis to rank the best. Yes, just to see this. All right, as our first result, looking crop variability and hazards, we see here that most of the rain, most of the wet hazard, we have a positive correlation. And for heat, we have negative correlation. That makes sense. And also for dry, we have a negative correlation. And for millet, if we look at millet and sorghum, they show sensitivity to temperatures extremes, but respond positively to rainfall events. And when now looking for peanut, peanut is highly sensitive to temperature and drought, with strong negative correlation for heat. And then for rice now, you see that I strongly benefit from rainfall, but is negatively impacted by extreme temperature and drought. And this we explained it because that rice is mainly irrigated in these areas. And now looking for now sorghum. Sorghum is less negatively impacted by drought compared to peanuts, but is still sensitive to high temperature. In this area, we know that sorghum and millet, they are mainly rain-fed, and people are not even using fertilizer. That is why peanut, millet, and sorghum respond, have a high response to water. And now, we now focus on rain now and looking what are the relationship between rain and yield anomaly, looking for the 4-5 crops in all the areas. We see that yield are positively correlated with rain, which is normal, but we realize that in some areas, mainly in the southern part, we have a negative correlation. This is, we think that as in the northern southern part, we have a lot of rain. So it is maybe because of the extreme rain can have impact on yield. That is why we have negative correlation. And also rainfall benefit rice, but negatively peanut in some region. Because in some region we see that peanut is negatively correlated with high rainfall, which is normal because when peanut reach maturity and you have rain coming, no, in some cases peanut are like it's growing again. It's like we have emergency. So that is why higher rainfall can negatively impact peanut. And now for millet and sorghum, they show mixed correlation and are more drought resistant and may not benefit from excessive rainfall. This is well known in this context of in the country that millet and sorghum, they are quite drought resistant. And that is why millet and sorghum, they cultivate it in areas where you have less resources. Now looking for our machine learning model, we are trying to look at the performance of the models. And so we have many outputs for we have like a lot of metrics, but here we show just the correlation and the RMSE. So we notice that we have the high performance of the model for maize and peanut. And we think that it is because at maize and peanut, we have like very good data, which is maybe given this high correlation. And now for millet, rice, and sorghum, for rice, we think that because of irrigation, so you have a mixed irrigation and rain-fed, so the correlation is less compared to millet, compared to maize and peanut. And this also we observe it in the RMMFC for both tested data and trained data. Here I have to highlight that we use 70% of our data for training the model and 30% of the data for testing the model. And we saw that rice, millet, and sorghum depicted the same trend. So these are somehow cereals which have the same, I would say, same behavior. I'm almost finishing. So now we look at the case of peanut, and we use this looking for the SAP analysis. So this show how or which hazard or climate hazard is driving yield variability. So if you look at the figure on the left side, we see that the main parameters are the GD, so gross degree days, and you have minimum temperature, which is TR, and maximum temperature. So we have this temperature effect that controlling the peanut variability. And looking for the figure on your right, we realize that the most important feature for peanut prediction include rain, minimum temperature, gross degree days, maximum temperature, and VPD. These are the most parameters that control yield variability. So we would say that rainfall remains the main dominant drivers of yield variability of peanut, and VPD remains significant, showing that drought period negatively affect yield. And for summary, we say that yield variability is positively correlated with wet hazard and negatively for drought and heat, which is what we are expecting. Rice and peanut were more affected by drought than other crops. Maize saw fewer effect from hazard compared to millet and sorghum, and suggesting that other factors such as management practices may also be impacted maize, as in this country, maize is more fertilized than millet and sorghum. And I'm ending for some analysis we want to do further. So analyzing yield failure, and my question is how we will define yield failure in this context of this country. We also want to add soil properties in our models to see if soil also impacting yield variability. And we want to also compare the result with process-based crop model simulations. And at the end, you have to adjust maturity date, because here we use like the same variety for all this area. And now we want to adjust the maturity date based on site specifics, right? So thank you for your attention. If you have questions.
Thank you, Babaka. We can only have one question.
Thank you for your presentation. Notice your last bullet in the conclusions, you indicated that management might be a factor. I'm just wondering, why was it not really a primary consideration among your factors that you considered in your simulations? Because we know fertilizer, for example, is if you plot fertilizer against yield, there's a very nice correlation. So why was it not part of these simulations? Thank you.
Yes, the response is that I would say we are in the beginning of this study. So we first focus on the climate drivers that impact yield variability. But our next step will be, of course, to put this management system in the model and so on, and see what will happen compared to the climate on the soils. Yes.
Thanks, Babaka, for the great presentation. I couldn't help noticing that rice, even though irrigated, behaved very similar to the other crops that I suppose are not irrigated, because we were stressing that rice was irrigated. But still, rice was responding positively to rainfall and is susceptible to drought. Does that mean rice is very imperfectly irrigated, and like the irrigation water supply is driven by the precipitation, or is it that precipitation is correlated with some other driver like pests or anything that are not captured but make rice behave similar?
If you see the results, rice, yes, responding positively to rain, because in this area, in the northern part, where is the main part where rice is grown is irrigated. Nevertheless, in the central and the southern part, you have also rice in rain-fed conditions. But it is in the irrigation part, we use the river, so it is not like water coming from the rain, but it is the water coming from the river. Nevertheless, in the central part, in the southern part, we have a rain-fed rice. That is why it's responding to rainfall, but compared to millet and sorghum, it's less, right? Maybe last question.
Okay. So it's a time, maybe you can talk later. Yeah. So thank you, Babaka. Let's welcome the next speaker, Jose. He's on the line.
Hi everyone. I'll share my screen. Okay, great. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Guarin. I'm a research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Today, I'm excited to present some of the work that the AgMIP wheat team has done in collaboration with the International Wheat Yield Partnership, looking at the evidence for increasing global wheat yield potential. And so, as mentioned, this was part of the AgMIP wheat phase 4 to explore the upper limits of wheat growth. And this resulted in 4 separate studies. Today, I'm mainly going to focus on the one that I led, which was looking at the wheat yield potential. However, there are additional studies. For example, there was one that Sibel Dwary and Pierre Martre led, which looked at winter wheat response to variable sowing dates and densities using these same high-yielding traits that we're going to be talking about today. And this was published in the Journal of Experimental Botany. There was also another study by Tommaso Stella and Heidi Weber that looked at the changes in wheat crop traits, so the ones that we're going to talk about, and how the changes in these traits could affect the yield stability under future climate change. This was published in Silico Plants. And then I believe many of you are familiar with Pierre's most recent study that was published in Nature Plants, which was looking at the nitrogen demand and cost for improving these wheat yields using these high-yielding traits under future climate conditions. And so with that being said, to hop right into it, like, so what traits am I talking about? So these are based on field experiment data from a double haploid experiment from CIMMYT. So actually, it's amazing that you all are there. Like, CIMMYT is where we got this data from, and it had some of the highest wheat yields in the literature at 16.6 tons per hectare dry weight, which is phenomenal. This was in Valdivia, Chile, not the Mexico site, but still, it was incredible to have this data. And so we worked with Matthew Reynolds and Gemma Molero. They were the experimentalists that helped us with this study. And so we looked at Buenos Aires, Argentina, Ciudad Obregón, Mexico, and Valdivia, Chile. And so the DH lines were based on the cross between Bacanora and Weeble. And what we did with this data is that we wanted to evaluate if a multi-model ensemble of wheat crop models could reproduce these high yield gains. And we looked at we conducted this in 2 steps. So step 1 was we provided the Czech cultivar Bacanora to all the modeling teams, and they had all the data, and they could calibrate it how they typically could. So that was just your standard calibration procedure. But then in step 2, it was a blind test study where we just provided the changes to these physiological traits that we calculated based on the field experiment data. And so using this table of trait changes, they adjusted their model parameters and then simulated the locations, and we compare and see how they perform. And then the second objective was, since we had such a cool data set with the highest yield like ever reported, we wanted to do something interesting, and we determined the relationship between wheat yield production potential and the cumulative incoming solar radiation. And the goal was to create some sort of relationship that was similar to the French and Schultz wheat production water use relationship. And what we did is we developed what we called the efficiency of radiation capture and use, the ERCU. And then for the third objective, we wanted to take this to the global level. So we estimated the wheat potential using the AgMIP wheat protocol, which is slightly different than the AgMIP GGCMI protocol, but it used the 34 high rainfall or irrigated global AgMIP locations that are in the AgMIP wheat database. And these are the same locations that were used in Senhold's 2019 climate global change biology study. And the map on the right shows the different locations. So you see that we have a good spread of the wheat growing locations across the world. And so the traits that we looked at were these 6 main traits. 2 were sources and 4 were sinks. So we looked at the radiation use efficiency, the light extinction coefficient, the fruiting efficiency, the potential grain filling duration, the potential grain filling rate, and the potential grain size. And so on the right, you see the percent change compared to the Czech cultivar, which was Bacanora. And we calculated all of these based on the calculations there. And this was all based on the CIMMYT field experiment data. And it was phenomenal to have that kind of data with that detail that we were able to calculate these changes. And so we provided this table to the modelers to see if they were able to reproduce the high yielding yields from the DH line. And just real quick, the list of modelers. So we had 29 modeling teams, which was amazing. The AgMIP wheat participation is phenomenal. And so this is the we're looking at an ensemble of 29 models. And then for some of the other studies I showed, it was also over 20. And then in Pierre's, it's a subset of this. I believe it was either 12 or 16 of the 29 models participated in that study. So it was a great participation, and it was modeling teams from around the world. And so what we found, so this is the results of the calibration and the blind test evaluation. So on the top, we have the calibration using the Czech cultivar Bacanora. And we have the sowing to maturity duration. So in other words, the phenology, the biomass, and the yield. And what we found is that the root mean squared error was 0.47 for the phenology, which wasn't the best, but it was still within 8 days. So that was acceptable. Final biomass R squared was 0.66. And the yield was 0.88. So the majority of modeling teams were calibrating to yield, which is fine. That's what we asked them to do. And it was performing well. And again, this was over, so 5 years in Valdivia, 1 year in Buenos Aires, and then 4 years in Obregon. And then what we did is we gave them the table of the trait changes, and then we saw how it performed, which if you compare here, the green dots and the gray boxes on the 3 plots at the bottom, that's the stats that are shown in each box plot. So for the sowing to maturity, we had an R squared of 0.84, so it actually increased, so that was great. Final biomass stayed the same. The R squared was 0.66, and yield was 0.91, so it actually improved as well. So the modelers were definitely able to reproduce the yield gains that we were seeing based on the trait changes that we provided. So providing accurate results resulted in, or accurate input resulted in accurate output. So that was great to see. Then looking at the ERCU, so we looked at the relationship between the wheat biomass potential and the cumulative incoming solar radiation at the CIMMYT location. So again, this is just for the CIMMYT locations. And what we did is we took a linear response for the best yielding DH line, which was in 2010 in Valdivia, and then the fastest yielding Bacanora line, which was 2012 and also in Valdivia, and created this linear relationship that you see, which is the equation, and that is what we said was the upper limit of the biomass growth based on these high yielding traits. And so then once we had that, we then multiplied it by the standard harvest index, or the average harvest index of 0.45. But this could be actually higher. So the theoretical limit for harvest index is 0.64. So we could have multiplied by that to get an even higher yield response to really get the potential, but we decided to keep it a risk averse. So this line shows the wheat yield potential. And again, the reason that this is cool is because if you go look at the cumulative seasonal incoming solar radiation, so if you go to NASA Power and get the seasonal solar radiation for any field in the world, you can just look at this line and have an idea of your yield potential at that specific location. And using, I guess, it would only be limited by solar radiation. And then as comparison, we also plotted the 31 additional AgMIP wheat locations just as a check to see where they would fall along this line. So open dots, or open symbols, I should say, are the Czech cultivars, and the solid symbols are the high yielding lines. And you can see that the closest points to the line are the ones that were observed at CIMMYT, which were record-breaking yields. And so once we had the models, so once we knew that the models were working and we had this cool relationship, then we took it to the global level based on the 2020 FAO data. So we have our 2020 global yields. This is based on FAO. And then we have the simulated global yield with modified traits. So in other words, when we just provide that table to the modelers and they simulated all 34 locations, and then we took those modeling results and upscaled them to the global level using the AgMIP protocol, we found a 37% increase in yield. And then when we did the same thing, but using the ERCU global potential yield, so in other words, if all the points were on that black line, like the potential, what would that be? And we would see a doubling in global yields, which is great, but obviously there's significant caveats with that. And then to look at the global production, we multiplied by the 2020 harvested area. We assumed 30% rain-fed production and kept that constant because it's a risk-averse assumption. It's unlikely that the traits would benefit rain-fed production that much compared to irrigated. So we decided to keep it at 30%. And with that being said, the highlights were that we found that the wheat crop models can reproduce the measured yield enhancing traits. The canopy photosynthesis increased global wheat production by 37%. And then it could double by over like 108% when only limited by solar radiation when we use the ERCU line. And then just to switch gears a little bit, so just to find this, I just want to highlight Pierre's study because it's also incredible. So Pierre took these same traits that we just talked about, and then he looked at the relative change in global production and nitrogen demand from these improved traits under RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And so those are the figures you see at the bottom. The yellow is the current nitrogen application rate. The pink is the rate to maximize grain yield, and the blue is to maximize grain yield while keeping grain protein concentration above 12%. And what we found is that by combining the high yielding traits without adapting nitrogen, the average wheat potential could increase by 5% while using 8% less nitrogen due to improved nitrogen use efficiency, which is fantastic to see. But in order to reach the high yields that were projected into the future, which was up to 51%, it would require 36% more nitrogen supply, which is obviously an issue because that would lead to more carbon emissions. So nitrogen use efficiency does need to be improved as well when looking at these high yields in the future. And with that being said, the data for these studies is available on the Open Data Journal for Agricultural Research. It's you can download if you would like. And then that will do it for me. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jose. And we will take one question.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks for this really nice and interesting presentation. I was wondering whether the relation between the cumulative solar radiation and the yield is actually, you showed a linear function, but I think it looks more, or I would expect like a saturation effect. So that's why I'm wondering why you're not fitting a logarithmic function here.
Florian, so that's a great point. We chose linear because it was the most simplistic approach, but it could be logarithmic. So we were seeing that a bit actually. If you see, so at the purple points, it does seem to level off a bit, but even at 3,000 cumulative degree or megajoules per meter squared, which is a pretty long season, it was still decently linear, so that's why we kept it. But there is a valid point to use a logarithmic scale. We just kept it linear for simplicity.
Okay, thank you, Jose.
Okay,
yeah, so our final speaker, is Jonas Jagermeyer. While the slides loads, please forgive my verbosity to introduce Jonas, who has May affiliation in Columbia Climate School and the co-lead the Global Greedy Crop Model, GGCMI, with Christoph Müller, who are mostly responsible for the success so far. I guess he will walk us through this successful journey with us today, right?
Yeah, I'll use this mic. I push back on largely responsible because it's a community effort. We're just bringing together a couple of folks and they do the work. Okay, so the session is actually over already. And we have a trillion of slides. So I don't really know what to do. I'm gonna flicker a couple of things and flash, and we're not gonna go through everything. And then I think that's it. So what I was planning is to show some recent highlights or studies that came out that I think could be interesting for the group, and then also give an outlook what's coming. And we've talked about that in the GGCMI session a little bit, so I think I cut it short on the outlook and just highlight a couple of recent papers and findings that are worth mentioning. Let's see if I can advance. All right, we don't need to look at that. We have a online tool now, an aggregation tool that helps end users get access to the data and find different aggregation levels. And it turned out to be really useful, and we have a couple of folks who like it a lot. So I encourage you to go find it. You probably can't type in the link, but it's a handy tool. You can select from different models, climate models, aggregation level scenarios, put in your own mask if you want to, and that gives you an access point to the GGCMI ensemble. Please check it out. Here's a study that only uses a crop calendar we produced, but it is a new land use data set that's potentially relevant for a couple of folks. It's an update to the widely used Merca data. This is centered on the 2015 snapshot, I guess. It includes a bunch of crops. So I encourage you to check that out and use it as a reference crop mask for the current conditions. And it comes with the crop calendar too. So that's handy. Sorry, I was saying snapshot. I think it's a timeline too. So this is important to know. It's not, it's transient in time. This is actually, now we're talking a little bit about uncertainty in model ensemble composition. And I think this is a really interesting thing to highlight. A Chinese team took the GGCMI data and analyzed a little bit different clusters in the model characteristics. For wheat, you can find the different models on this polar plot, how they respond similarly in their climate change response, and same for maize. And then we can use those data to those clusters to look at the spatial pattern, geographic pattern. And the top line here is if you combine all models, you can attribute uncertainty from GCMs, climate models, and the GGCMs, the crop models. And in the top line, you see that climate model contribution is largely blue, and the crop model contribution largely red, which means most of the uncertainty is introduced by the crop models. However, if you look at different clusters, cluster 2 indicates that actually some models have a more balanced response, and the climate models do matter in the composition of uncertainty. And if you go back to the cluster 2 for maize, located here. So this is some good news. It's the models are not only terrible, there's also some information in here. In a similar vein, Bin Wang and a couple of people in the room worked on a more structured understanding of uncertainty sources. And it's too small for you to really read out or see, but there's different components: model process, climate data, crop management, parameters, soil data, and data aggregation. And this is a meta study combining all sorts of published sources. And this study really nicely highlights that, as we know, crop models still introduce the largest source of uncertainty here with over 50%. And this is the reference point. The other sources of uncertainty really pale in comparison to the structure of the model sources. All right, so now I'm switching gears, go a little faster. Water is important. We know that water logging is a big topic now. Here is a paper that looks at flooding. I'm not going to go through those figures. I just want to spark interest. Please look up the paper if you're interested. We also worked on the economic aspects of yield changes. This is a study looking at price changes and labor impacts, a very interesting angle to compensate, to regulate the CO2 effect a little bit in terms of labor force. Complex figures behind that, but I think it's an interesting way to look at the problem from a more holistic way. Again, we're using integrated assessment models to look at the market dynamics, trade dynamics, and food consumption at national level. This is a paper out of the PIC Potsdam team looking at self-sufficiency indices. In the top left corner is a no climate change current situation, and then different GGCMI models, how they would project changes in self-sufficiency in indices under a high emission scenario. And you see the regular patterns that we would expect, but there's also some nuances that are very interesting to look at. I'm going to rush over these. Please excuse my approach here. So this is one study I want to highlight because it was mentioned in the morning. Mario brought up the Lancet report. We contributed GGCMI data. Those are more in the background, so they kind of give the canvas for then evaluating the changes of switching to a more sustainable diet. The main point here is that you can compare a business as usual diet with a more sustainable and nutritious Eat Lancet 2.0 diet across food system components. And as you would expect, meat consumption, sugar, and dairy products are expected to decline in comparison to a business as usual scenario. But then vegetables, fruit, nuts, and oil seeds are going up because the recommended diet would recommend those particularly, and that will have effects obviously on prices, demand, and production and area. So this is an interesting background paper that looks a little bit under the hood what these recommended diets would do to food system demand. We are also working on extremes. So this is an upcoming study that I would go through slightly more in detail just to highlight that we're working on extremes and we're aware of the problem. For maize, looking back historically, using a benchmark data set, we have a significant decline in benchmark yields of about, 20% under a hot and dry event. And the GGCMI ensemble can represent that fairly well for maize globally aggregated. So there is signal. It's a good, this is good to see. But then if we look across the ensemble for individual models, we see a wide diversity of responses from overestimation to less sensitive situations. And then if we look to other crops, wheat, for example, shows a less good picture, and then rice is very insensitive here. So there's still a lot of homework to be done. Okay, looking at the time, I'm gonna walk you through this timeline of upcoming projects and then leave it there. We're here at AgMIP10. An ongoing initiative right now is AgMIP ozone and the GGCMI collaboration. So I think, as I mentioned before, we're inviting everybody who can respond to ozone, who runs a model that can respond to ozone, to come speak to us. And Jose, who just spoke before me, we love to include the models. The protocol is ready to go. So this is happening right now. The big new initiative this year is a forward-looking management and adaptation group simulation effort where we invite all the GGCMI members to run a harmonized protocol on management changes. And then there is a dedicated extreme event study where we use a climate scenario that has the extreme events removed as a counterfactual to compare and attribute impacts of these extreme events on crop productivity over the course of the century. And then scanning the horizon. Oh, sorry, there's the nuclear conflict going on, a big grant that was given to YASA in Austria, PIC and Columbia University, improving models, but then run crop models in a larger ensemble to further our understanding of indirect effects of a nuclear war on food security globally, including trade and demand changes. And then on the horizon, we're getting ready for IPC7. AgMIP will, again, bias adjust the climate data from CMIP7. And as soon as the fast track data is available, we will have a frozen model version, hopefully just push the button, run a quick fast track assessment that ideally in a perfect world is fast enough to be included in IPC7. I have slides to all of these things, so if you have questions, come on and we speak later. Thanks.
We still have time for a few questions.
Okay, yeah, sure.
If you have, yeah.
No worries.
All right.
Yeah.
No, just can you comment a little bit more on the uncertainty introduced by the model choice? If I understood correctly, this is the main source of uncertainty. Can you expand a little bit more on how to tackle this?
Well, that's the big question, right? And that's part of the reason why AgMIP exists. That's a finding that came out of the very, very first multimodal assessment study in 2014, Rosenzweig seminal paper in PNAS, that the impact models introduce larger amounts of uncertainty than the climate model ensemble, which makes sense because the climate models open up with a range of projected atmospheric futures. And then for each of those, the impact models open another range of potential impacts, right? And since then, we thought one way to address escalating uncertainty is by harmonizing protocols and run multimodal assessments. So that's the idea of GGSMI, to run 10 or 15 models on the same protocol. We have a range, and the median is probably a better guess than any of the individual members. But that doesn't mean we're complacent and leaning back. I think model development is really important. Calibration is increasingly important to make sure that the participating models are actually doing the work they're supposed to do. And something that we've discussed throughout the meeting here is that we may want to switch to a little bit of a stricter benchmarking and inclusion protocol. Right now, we're basically allowing every model that is considered reasonable to contribute. And maybe we should revisit that a little bit and say, well, we want to make sure that your responses to CO2, to water stress, to heat stress are within the realm of expectation, so we can make sure the model is somewhat reasonable in addition to just simulating historical yield variability, because that is not a great, doesn't say your model is fit for future assessments. So I think a lot around those questions, how we can select models better, calibrate them better, and then targeted model improvement. We mentioned waterlogging, that's a big one. There's a lot to be done, and I think we came a long way, but those studies also show that we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. So that put the end to our sessions. Thank you everyone for participating. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.